Karen had always considered herself someone who deserved special treatment. She was used to getting things her way, believing that rules didn't really apply to her, as long as she got what she wanted. That afternoon, Karen was attending a royal event at an exclusive estate, a grand, sprawling place with manicured gardens and high security. It was the kind of event where only the most influential people were invited. Karen felt like she belonged there, though she wasn't sure how or why she had received an invitation. As she walked through the estate, she admired the luxury around her, from the perfectly decorated halls to the fine paintings on the walls. The guests were all talking and laughing, but Karen was more focused on one thing: getting through the event quickly and getting the attention she thought she deserved. She didn't want to waste time in a long line, especially when she saw the royal guards standing at the entrance to a restricted area, where only VIPs could go. Karen was already growing impatient. She didn't feel like waiting around. After all, she had something important to do, or at least that's what she told herself. She had a plan in mind, a quick and easy way to get what she wanted. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stun gun. She had brought it along for protection, but it had never been used before. It was just a safety measure, she told herself. She had seen other people carry one, and it gave her a sense of power, like she could control any situation. Karen, now determined, walked confidently toward the guard. She could see him standing tall, his posture impeccable, and his eyes scanning the crowd with military precision. But Karen wasn't intimidated. She was used to getting past obstacles. The guard was just another barrier she would have to overcome. He was there, standing between her and the path she wanted to take, and Karen didn't think twice about how to handle it. As she approached him, she smiled. She was calm, almost too calm, as if she had everything under control. She took a deep breath and aimed the stun gun directly at the guard, her finger hovering over the trigger. The guard didn't notice her approaching, too focused on the people around him. At that moment, Karen made her move. She pressed the button on the stun gun. The sound of the stun gun firing echoed briefly, but instead of the guard stepping back, he didn't even flinch. To her shock, he remained standing tall and unwavering, his eyes now locking onto hers. There was no reaction, no surprise, no hesitation from him. Karen froze, realizing that the scene she had imagined, a quick, easy pass through the guard, was not going to happen. The power she thought she held in her hand was useless. For a moment, Karen stood there, feeling the weight of the situation start to hit her. She had expected the guard to be incapacitated, to step aside, or at least react in some way. But nothing had gone according to her plan. The guard calmly, almost sternly, looked at her, his expression unreadable. Suddenly, Karen felt the tension of the moment. Her actions were no longer just a misstep. They had now escalated into something serious. She was no longer just a person at an event. She was a person who had crossed a line, a person who had made a dangerous decision. And the guard, now fully aware of what had just occurred, wasn't about to let her get away with it. He began to move toward her, signaling to other guards nearby. Karen could feel her heart race. Her thoughts were a blur as she realized the gravity of what she had just done. The guard wasn't the only one watching now. The situation had just turned into something far beyond what Karen had ever imagined. The moment the stun gun had failed to subdue the guard, Karen's heart began to race. She stood frozen, watching as the guard's calm demeanor sent a chill down her spine. For a second, she thought maybe she had just made a huge mistake. The guard's eyes were locked onto hers, and there was no trace of fear in his expression. Only a firm, almost disappointed look that made Karen feel small. She had assumed that by using the stun gun, she could simply bypass the guard and continue on her way. But now she realized how wrong she was. In the next instant, the guard raised his hand and motioned to others nearby. It was as though he was calling for backup, and Karen could see the other guards quickly approaching. The realization hit her hard. She had just drawn attention to herself, and not in the way she had expected. What had seemed like a simple act to get ahead was now turning into something far more serious. She could feel her face turn red with embarrassment and panic. The weight of what she had done was beginning to sink in. The other guards quickly surrounded her, and for the first time, Karen felt completely powerless. She had always been someone who believed she could handle any situation. But now, as the guards loomed over her, she realized she was completely out of her depth. The events were unfolding quickly, and there was no easy way out. She looked around and saw that others at the event were starting to notice the commotion. Whispers and murmurs spread through the crowd, and Karen could feel their eyes on her, judgmental and full of curiosity. A guard stepped forward, his voice steady but stern. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his tone sharp. Karen opened her mouth, but for a moment she couldn't find the right words. She had no good explanation, no reasonable excuse for her actions. She had just wanted to get her way, and now it had backfired in the worst possible way. As she stood there, the realization of her mistake hit her harder than any stun gun could have. She had acted impulsively, without thinking of the consequences. The guard's calmness was a stark contrast to her growing anxiety. She had thought that a quick decision would get her out of the situation, but now she could see how dangerous and foolish that thinking had been. One of the guards called for security, and soon, more people arrived. Karen was no longer in control of the situation. The guards had already taken over, and now they were making their next move. She felt herself being escorted away from the scene, her mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. The voices of the crowd faded as she was led through a side passage. The shame she felt began to weigh heavily on her shoulders. As she was guided toward a secure area, Karen couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so quickly. She had never imagined that a simple push for what she wanted would lead to such a dramatic turn of events. It was too late to take back her actions, and the consequences of that moment were now unfolding before her, one step at a time. Karen was escorted through the hallways of the royal estate, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. She had always been someone who didn't take kindly to being told what to do, and now, here she was, being guided like a criminal through a space she had once thought of as hers to navigate freely. The regal setting, once a source of excitement and wonder, now felt suffocating. Every step she took echoed in her ears, and with each passing second, the gravity of her actions weighed more heavily on her. The guards led her to a secluded room, away from the rest of the event. It was quiet, almost eerily so. There she was left alone for what felt like an eternity, giving her plenty of time to reflect on the situation. Her fingers clenched nervously around the small stun gun in her bag, the very tool that had brought her to this point. She thought about how it had seemed like such a harmless object when she first picked it up. It was supposed to be for protection, for emergencies. But she had never imagined using it like this, never imagined it would lead to a confrontation with royal security. A few moments later, a man entered the room. He was one of the estate's senior security officers, his uniform sharp and professional. He didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. He looked at her with an expression that mixed professionalism with concern, as though he were trying to assess whether she was a threat or just a confused individual who had made a terrible mistake. "Ma'am, we need to understand what happened," the officer said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with all kinds of situations before. "You attempted to harm a royal guard. This is a serious matter." Karen opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain herself? How could she tell this man that she didn't mean any harm, that she was just trying to avoid waiting in line like everyone else? But she knew that wouldn't work. She knew that the guard had every right to stop her. And now, her hasty decision had brought everything to a halt, not just for her but for everyone at the event. She tried to gather her thoughts, but the officer's next words struck her hard. "You understand that you could face legal action, right? Using a stun gun in this way could lead to charges." The weight of his words felt like a heavy stone in her chest. She had never thought it would go this far. She had only wanted to skip a few steps, get past the guard, and move on with her day. She had never considered the consequences, never thought that her actions could lead to such a serious outcome. As the officer spoke, Karen's thoughts drifted to the royal guard she had tried to bypass. She had expected him to step aside, to let her pass. But instead, he had stood there, completely unmoved by the stun gun. His calm, composed demeanor had only made her feel more out of place, as though she were the one who had crossed the line. She thought about how professional he had been, how he had handled the situation without losing his composure. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't just dealing with someone in a uniform. She was dealing with someone who had likely been trained for situations just like this. The officer didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. It was clear he was giving her time to process what had happened, but Karen didn't know how to explain herself. All she could feel was regret. She had acted impulsively, not thinking things through. And now she was left with the consequences of those actions. The reality of the situation was setting in. What had started as an attempt to bypass a simple obstacle was now something much bigger. Karen's mind was filled with questions about what would happen next. Would she face legal consequences? Would the guards press charges? What would everyone think when they found out what she had done? There were no easy answers, and for the first time, Karen wasn't sure how to handle herself. She had learned a hard lesson, that actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, could have far-reaching consequences. Karen sat in the quiet room, her mind racing, trying to process everything that had happened. The security officer had left to consult with others, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The sound of her own breathing seemed louder in the silence, and her thoughts kept returning to the moment she had pulled out the stun gun. She could still hear the faint hum of it in her ears, still see the guard standing firm, unaffected by the shock. It felt like everything had spiraled out of control in just a matter of moments. When the officer returned, he wasn't alone. 2 more security personnel had joined him, and they seemed even more serious. The atmosphere had shifted from one of confusion to one of stern authority. Karen could feel her anxiety growing as she realized just how serious this situation had become. She had tried to dismiss it as a mistake, but now it was clear that it had crossed a line she had never intended to cross. "Ma'am, we need to clarify your actions," the officer began, his tone calm but direct. "The use of the stun gun is a serious matter, especially in a setting like this." Karen nodded, her throat tight with regret. She knew that there was no excuse for what she had done. She had thought it was a harmless act, just a way to make her way through the crowd, but now it seemed like she had done something far more significant than she realized. One of the new officers spoke up, adding, "Do you understand the potential consequences? This could lead to charges, and you could face legal trouble." Karen's heart sank. The words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely afraid. She had always believed that her actions wouldn't have lasting consequences, but now she was beginning to see just how wrong she had been. The officers continued to ask questions, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. Karen answered as honestly as she could, her words stumbling out in between deep breaths. She had never expected things to escalate this far. She had only wanted to avoid the hassle of waiting and thought the stun gun would give her an easy way to bypass the guard. But now, every word she spoke seemed to dig her deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. As the officers discussed her situation, Karen's mind wandered to the people outside. She wondered what they must be thinking now. The royal estate had always been a place of grandeur, of elegance, and now it felt like her moment of impulsive behavior had stained it. She wondered how many people had seen what had happened, how many of them had watched as she was escorted away like a criminal. The reality of the situation was settling in, and it was harder to ignore with each passing minute. She had always prided herself on being in control, on making the right decisions. But now, in the face of the consequences, she felt anything but in control. It was a humbling experience, and for the first time, Karen felt like she truly understood the importance of thinking before acting. The consequences of her actions weren't just a slap on the wrist. They were real, and they were serious. As the officers continued their discussion, Karen sat quietly, her head in her hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had learned the hard way that some decisions couldn't be undone, and some moments couldn't be erased. The weight of her impulsive choice felt heavier than she had ever imagined, and she began to realize that this lesson, this painful, shocking lesson, was one she would never forget. Karen sat there, feeling the weight of everything she had done slowly sink in. Her mind was still spinning from the events that had unfolded just hours earlier. She had been so sure of herself when she decided to bypass the royal guard with the stun gun, thinking it was a harmless way to speed things up. But now, as she sat in that quiet room, she saw how wrong she had been. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what she had done wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. The officers had left her alone for a while, probably to discuss the situation and decide on the next steps. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. Karen kept replaying the scene over and over in her mind. She could see the royal guard, calm and unshaken, as if he had seen it all before. She had expected him to step aside, or at least react, but instead, he had handled the situation with such professionalism that it only made her feel more out of place. Her actions had been impulsive and thoughtless, and the reality of it was finally hitting her. She tried to remember a time when she had felt truly in control. But now, it seemed like that feeling of control had been nothing more than an illusion. For years, Karen had lived her life thinking that rules were something for others to follow, not for her. She had never truly understood the importance of respecting boundaries and authority. To her, the world had always seemed like a place where she could push and get what she wanted, no matter the cost. But now, sitting in that room, she understood just how dangerous that mindset could be. As she reflected on everything, Karen began to think about the people who might have witnessed the scene. She had always considered herself the center of attention, but now, she imagined how others might see her. How would they view someone who used a stun gun in such a careless way? What kind of message did that send? The embarrassment began to feel overwhelming. She wasn't just a guest at an event anymore. She was the person who had made a scene, someone who had acted recklessly and without thought. As time passed, Karen found herself thinking more about the guard, about how calm and composed he had been. She hadn't expected him to react the way he did, and it made her realize that there were people out there who were trained to handle situations like hers. His professionalism had been a sharp contrast to her impulsive behavior. The thought made Karen feel even more ashamed of what she had done. She had expected an easy solution, a quick way out. Instead, she had been confronted with the reality of the situation. The minutes felt like hours as Karen waited in the room. The officers had told her they needed time to decide what would happen next, but it was clear that the situation wasn't as simple as she had hoped. She had hoped to walk away from this with a simple apology, maybe even a warning. But now she was starting to realize that the consequences could be far more serious than that. The idea of facing charges was a frightening thought. She had never been in trouble before, never had to deal with the possibility of something like this hanging over her head. In that quiet room, Karen began to come to terms with the fact that her actions had consequences. The lesson she was learning was difficult to accept, but she knew she couldn't escape it. The kind of behavior she had shown that day wasn't something she could just shrug off. It had opened her eyes to how important it was to think before acting, to consider the impact of her choices not just on herself, but on others as well. The realization was both humbling and painful, but it was a lesson she would carry with her forever. Karen was left in the small, dimly lit room, her thoughts spiraling as she waited for the officers to return. It felt like hours had passed, though in reality, it had only been a short time. She could hear the muffled voices outside the door as the officers continued their discussions. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how serious the situation had become. It wasn't just a simple mistake anymore. It was something that could change the course of her life. When the officers finally returned, their expressions were unreadable, and Karen immediately knew this was the moment when the consequences of her actions would be laid out before her. The officer who had first spoken to her entered the room, his face still stern but now with a slight shift in his demeanor. The calm, collected professionalism he displayed made it clear that he had dealt with situations like this before, but for Karen, this was uncharted territory. She had never imagined being on the other side of the law, let alone facing legal consequences for something she had done so impulsively. "Karen, we've had a chance to review the situation," the officer began, his tone more serious now. "The Royal Guards and security personnel are pressing charges for your actions. Using a stun gun in a public setting is a grave matter, especially when directed at someone in a position of authority. This is not something we can ignore." Karen felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The words seemed to echo in her mind, each one sinking in deeper. The reality of what was happening began to feel more real with every passing second. She had always been someone who lived with a sense of confidence, even arrogance at times. But now, as she sat there facing the officers, she felt small, unsure, and scared of what was to come. The officers continued explaining the steps that would follow. There would be legal procedures to go through, and Karen would have to face the consequences of her actions in court. The guard she had tried to bypass had not been harmed, but the very fact that she had tried to use force against someone who was simply doing his job had made her actions unforgivable in the eyes of those in charge. Karen didn't know how to respond. Her usual quick wit and ability to talk her way out of situations had failed her now. She had nothing left to say, nothing that could make the situation better. It wasn't just about avoiding the consequences, it was about understanding the impact of her actions. She had taken someone's authority for granted, assuming she could bypass the rules without consequence. And now she was faced with the reality of how wrong she had been. The officers gave her a moment of silence, allowing her to process the situation. The weight of what was happening started to feel overwhelming. And Karen finally found her voice. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet but genuine. "I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The officer nodded, but his expression remained firm. "Sorry doesn't change what happened, Karen. But it's a start. We'll make sure that you understand the seriousness of this before we proceed any further." Karen knew that there was no easy way out of this. She couldn't undo what she had done, and no amount of apologies would erase the fact that she had made a dangerous decision in the heat of the moment. The consequences were now unavoidable, and for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. She had no choice but to face what was coming and learn from her mistake. As the officers left the room to finalize the details, Karen sat alone, her mind still racing. The reality of her actions had become crystal clear. She had thought that a quick and easy solution would solve her problems, but now she knew that her hasty decision had brought far greater consequences than she could have imagined. It was a sobering lesson, one she would not soon forget. Karen spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions, trying to come to terms with the reality of her actions. The legal process was moving forward, and everything she had once taken for granted seemed to be slipping out of her hands. She had never imagined that a simple decision, one that seemed so insignificant in the moment, would lead to such serious consequences. The weight of what had happened sat heavily on her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, she was forced to face the full impact of her behavior. Her days were filled with meetings with lawyers, phone calls, and conversations with family and friends. They all tried to offer their support, but none of it could change what had already occurred. The media had picked up on the story, and Karen found herself facing judgment from people she had never met. She had always been someone who cared about her image, but now, the public's opinion felt like a distant echo, a reminder of how she had failed to live up to the standards she once held for herself. In private moments, Karen found herself thinking about the royal guard she had tried to bypass. She remembered his calm, unwavering stance as she had approached him with the stun gun. His professionalism had contrasted sharply with her own impulsive, reckless behavior. He hadn't been swayed by her actions, and that fact made Karen reflect deeply on the kind of person she wanted to be. His steady presence had shown her that there was strength and composure, and she realized that she had much to learn. She thought about how she had reacted in that moment, how she had felt entitled, as if the rules didn't apply to her. But now she saw things differently. The guard had done his job, not because he wanted to stop her, but because he was responsible for keeping order. Karen had assumed that by using the stun gun, she could avoid the consequences of her impatience. But in doing so, she had made a terrible misjudgment. As the days passed, Karen began to reflect on her own behavior and the attitudes that had shaped her actions. She had been so used to getting what she wanted, so accustomed to cutting corners and taking shortcuts. She had never stopped to think about how her actions could affect others. And this was the moment when that lack of consideration had come back to haunt her. Karen was beginning to understand that true strength didn't come from controlling others or finding ways to bypass obstacles. It came from respecting the rules, being patient, and taking responsibility for one's actions. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but Karen was slowly coming to terms with the fact that there were no quick fixes. The consequences of her actions were far-reaching, and she would need to work hard to rebuild the trust that had been broken. She started taking steps to understand how she could change her behavior moving forward. She signed up for anger management and impulse control classes, realizing that if she truly wanted to become a better person, she would have to face the flaws in her character and work on improving them. It wasn't an easy process, but Karen knew that this experience had changed her in ways she couldn't have predicted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the consequences of her actions. She was facing them head-on, determined to learn from her mistake and grow as a person. It wasn't going to be easy, but Karen was beginning to understand the true meaning of responsibility and accountability. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she was committed to making things right, one step at a time. The days after Karen's mistake were filled with a mix of emotions: regret, fear, and uncertainty. It felt like her life had been put on pause, as if she was standing still while everything around her continued to move forward. The legal process had taken longer than she expected, and every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into the consequences of her actions. But in all of this, Karen started to realize something important. She wasn't the same person she had been before the incident. As she continued to navigate the legal troubles and the public fallout, Karen found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had always prided herself on being independent, on doing things her own way. But now, she saw how that mindset had led her to make impulsive decisions without thinking about the long-term impact. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, that being in control didn't mean ignoring the consequences of your actions. It meant taking responsibility and understanding the responsibility that came with it. The first step towards change wasn't easy. Karen started by attending counseling, something she had never thought she needed before. She had always believed that she could handle everything on her own, that she didn't need help to get through tough situations. But now, she knew that was part of the problem. The counselor she spoke to helped her understand the underlying reasons behind her impulsive behavior and her tendency to disregard authority. Karen realized that, deep down, she had always felt entitled, as though the rules didn't apply to her. She had never stopped to consider how her actions might affect others, and that was a mindset she needed to change. As the weeks passed, Karen began to feel the weight of her actions slowly lifting. She was still facing the legal consequences of what she had done, but she was no longer running from them. She was facing them head-on, determined to make things right. It wasn't easy, but each day brought a new opportunity for growth. She began to understand the value of patience, of taking the time to think before acting. She started to realize that life wasn't about shortcuts or quick fixes. It was about learning from mistakes and becoming a better person because of them. The hardest part for Karen was the realization that she had let down the people who had trusted her. She had always been someone who believed she could get by with charm and quick thinking, but now she saw that those things didn't matter if you weren't acting with integrity. She had hurt the royal guard by assuming she could bypass him without any consequences, and she had hurt herself by thinking that her actions wouldn't be taken seriously. It took time, but Karen finally understood that true respect for others meant respecting the rules, no matter who you were. The media attention surrounding the incident eventually died down, but for Karen, the lessons she had learned remained. She began to focus on rebuilding the relationships that had been damaged, starting with her own self-respect. She worked hard to demonstrate that she had learned from her mistakes, and slowly, people started to see the changes in her. She was no longer the person who acted without thinking. She was someone who understood the weight of her actions and was committed to making better choices. By the time the legal proceedings were over, Karen had already changed. The punishment she faced wasn't as important as the growth she had gone through during the process. She had faced the consequences, learned from them, and now she was ready to move forward. The road hadn't been easy, and it still wasn't. But Karen knew one thing for sure. She would never forget the lessons she had learned, and she would never make the same mistake again. The shocking lesson she had learned would stay with her forever, and she would use it to guide her as she continued on her journey to become a better person.